Thank you. Yeah. So let me know maybe 10 minutes before it runs out, just so I know that maybe I need to speed up or maybe talk less about some things.
I'll give you 10 minutes more.
Yes. Good.
We're good to go whenever you are.
Okay, let's start. Yeah. Today I'm presenting the work of Urban Studio. The lecture is titled, as you see, Learning from Cities. And this is a work that was conducted by students, but also it's a part of my research as a part of a doctorate program that I'm involved in, especially during the last couple of years. So much of the work is a combination of both research and also testing of design and theoretical principles on the actual conditions discovered on a certain site, on a particular project. This particular lecture was presented just maybe a month ago in Chinese University of Hong Kong. That's why it says Chinese University of Hong Kong there. So it's been kind of adapted to certain circumstances, but also for today's presentation. Very important part of the study within urban design, especially in this studio, is the development of the culture of the studio in relationship to its subject matter, in the relation between architecture, urban design, and urban planning. During the last couple of years, I spent a lot of time reading texts within the field of urban or planning theory, actually, which is a field in a way much broader and encompasses also planning theory and several other theories, such as economic theory and social theories, philosophy, etc. So it's a combination of certain kind of social sciences, which in many ways relate to what we do as architects in society, but also these sort of approaches and these different theories open possibility to see our practice and theoretical approaches from different perspectives and actually enrichen them and help us develop a more critical perspective about today's world. I will briefly talk about very important points within this sort of approach that has been recently been introduced in my work with students, actually, in my own research. And there is a relation to what is the role of the planner, architect, what kind of effect and how much actually can we control the actual planning process and in fact, can we plan? And this is related to the most recent, or maybe let's say 10, 15 years, developments in the world with much of a planning discipline, as well as architects, has in a way been devaluated, or at least has been challenged in some ways that the traditional roles of architects and planners have been seriously challenged, and also the new types of knowledge are demanded from us, but also rethinking of what our roles are. So here I'm briefly going to mention the relation between the postmodern context and the kind of post-positivism, postmodernism, and then previous period of the positivist moment where science was what we relied on, and there was a certain sense that by the understanding of certain or a certainty of science and relying on it, that we could change the world, and this is the knowledge that we could rely on. So the knowledge itself has been questioned during this period, and then this opened a door for other types of knowledge. So what is knowledge is a very important question. And however, this is nothing new, and we can go back in time to Plato and Aristotle, where there was a notion that there is not such, for example, in Plato's case, there is not such thing as absolute knowledge. On the other hand, Aristotle is disagreeing with this idea, and for him that empiricism and learning from experiences actually could reveal the true nature of things. So this kind of debate continues through Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Locke, Hume and many others, many other philosophers, who also influenced in time our attitudes towards architecture and developed architecture theory. The last 2 decades, the planning theory has actually been dominated by this kind of post-positivist, postmodernist theory, but all of these different ways of thinking and approaches are actually running parallel. So it's not like we are going through some kind of a linear progression in understanding of our world, but in fact it is kind of cyclical, and there are parallel approaches and attitudes running. Another interesting idea that is very important in the way we're working in our studio is the kind of question of how is the urban habitat or a city, how is it produced, what are the mechanisms of development of cities, and then also in relation to that, how can we as architects and as well urban planners, in this case we're talking about the overlapping roles that are possible, how can we engage in these processes of transformations of cities? And then there are different theories, but one interesting one is a statement by Lefebvre that the idea of the productivist city, that there is not one single energy or one single source that actually can direct the development of the cities, but the humans act all in different patterns, and the kind of conglomeration or accumulation of all these activities actually creating a city. Almendinger, another theorist, is talking about 6 socio-spatial processes: urbanization, regional economic growth, change, city building, cultural differentiation and change, the transformation of nature, and urban politics and empowerment. Perhaps there is more, but it's very important also to create a kind of a platform that one can focus many different processes around certain themes and ideas. Another important question that's raised now, and question is planning as a form of ideology. Because in time of this kind of uncertainty of understanding and accepting that we are not omnipotent as professionals, then there is also acknowledged that much of decisions that are made by us come from the way that we are trained as practitioners, and part of it is ideological baggage that we carry as professionals. Also relation to the social system and social order, especially from the Marxist point of view. Here we have quotes from David Harvey, that in fact the planner, as well as any public official or any participant in the process of decision making, is actually has a role of perpetuating the existing social order, and this is done through repression, co-optation, and integration. Now I'm going to talk about how we work in the studio more in detail in relationship to some of these issues that are popping up. That it's very important, the title that says Learning from Cities, the approach in the studio is to look at every city for its own specific qualities and for all specific processes at a given time, but also what is the cultural background in shaping those cities, climatic, historic, etc. The question that also comes up is that usually we, as professionals, we work with formulation of a problem or solving problem. We are problem solvers. However, the kind of attitude is that not necessarily problems come on their own, that in fact we need to formulate the problem first and pose the question before we can actually even come to the point of resolving anything or working with any issues. Some of the questions that have been discussed both in our studio, but also to come from discussion in the world, and I think I mentioned them before, is that how can urban design and architecture have a more relevant role in the future of cities? How do we learn from the informal and unplanned development of cities, and how we can improve the practice by doing so? Another idea here in in our approach in working with students is opening possibilities for unexpected, and the cities are places of conflict and places where bizarre conditions and surrealist environments can happen. Also, the interpretation and reading of many different manifestations of the urban, but also through certain lens. For example, the time and movement in this case, it's a EuroLIL project, which also opens a possibility for students to look at not only urban space, but the kind of global sphere, world, environment, through different lenses, and try that you could actually understand that you can actually remap, and you can turn around and position yourself in the way that you present the geometry or geography of today's space and time. Also, very valuable publication that is being used from the beginning of when the course was started in 2008 is a publication by Bojan Studio made in Tokyo, and that dealt with the city completely emerging on its own without necessary intervention of architects. So it was architects attempting to read certain conditions and then perhaps try to learn something that they were not using in their own practice and open possibility for other ways of seeing the city. City where certain symbiotic relations start being generated, but also understanding why and how these spaces evolve, how they are related to social processes, how they are related to economy, development of infrastructure, how is the legal system working, and also cultural issues and so on. Another very important ingredient in development of the studies in our studio was my own background, coming from Belgrade, former Yugoslavia, today Serbia, and also the events, and also how did the events of the destruction of the country, also bombing in 1999, how did that shape the city? How was the isolation and also lack of governmental intervention within the city itself actually open up possibilities for the city to transform on its own? Here is a bombed bridge that was turned into a beach. And this is an extra from exhibit at Columbia University in New York. It was a video installation on the project that was done in recording these different urban phenomena through photographs and video. Also, another photograph related to this project and phenomena that happened in the city, which shows how the city, when completely left alone without any kind of interference, creates a kind of absurd situations, and basically starts turning into a kind of amoeba type of phenomena. A lot of refugees moving into a city, building up farms on top of the existing urban structures, buildings. These houses don't exist anymore, so they will, many years later they were removed. So this is a kind of image of something that doesn't exist, but it's popping up in many places around the world. I will focus on 4 main topics while I'm presenting projects. The comparative studies of behavior of cities, social ecological challenges, urban culture as a socio-political economic project, and technology ecology, the Anthropocene city. And I'm going to explain these 4 different topics while talking about the projects that we were involved in. Very important approach in deciding first what kind of projects are we going to work on every year or every semester is the relation between the context where I live now, or we live, or we're studying in Stockholm, in Sweden, and metropolitan and other centers around the world. In the first phase of the first couple of years in the studio, we explored Tokyo, London, Berlin, New York, Istanbul, Belgrade, Stockholm, through a set of comparative studies for students to actually conduct research of metropolitan, but also particular regional, local context, and understand the processes that affect their development, but then also compare them to the context of Sweden and understand why and how cities behave and what kind of forces affect their transformation. Here the question of planner and architect, the position and the role, was also introduced while students are making their propositions. And many questions are raised and discussed through the projects in relation to what students' proposals are. This was the first project, genetic code of the city, and then later so-called urban anatomy. I'll try to briefly talk about every city, what we learned. Here's London. This is an excerpt from one of the studies, which has to do with, in comparison to Stockholm, how is it and why that London has all of a sudden experienced transformation, and especially in the center, in the very heart of the city, and in Stockholm, there is not such or much slower transformation. This was put in a context of discussion of Stockholm center really not allowing any kind of greater level of urban development, taller buildings, and so on, but not in terms of aesthetical or kind of architectonic values, but more in relationship of a systematic understanding of economy, processes of cultural, but also technological and other forces which have actually made London. And here in this case, it was a competition between different parts of London, center and Canary Wharf, and so on. And then we have a study of Tokyo. Students have looked at the Shinjuku as a study that started with understanding the kind of very specific way that Tokyo is emerged as an urban metropolis, as a global urban metropolis, in a very short time, between 1945, when it was totally destroyed almost, until today. And, but also in very important understanding that there is a very strong connection between Japanese culture and the processes of urban development with high kind of technological dependence on high technology and economical processes, which are quite powerful forces in Tokyo. So here we can make a link between the way that property division and from the Meiji period, from the samurais up to today, actually still have a value and our influence is the main configuration of the landscape of the city, and so on. So students have done a kind of in-depth analysis in many different ways, and also relation of subway systems. So here you have a kind of high technology as mentioned, but also heavily linked with the sort of tradition ingrained in the city. And then comparison with parts of Stockholm, as well as the Stockholm metropolitan area, the Globen as well. And then students were making proposals. Here it's another typology, or more zoomed in, also looking at urban regulations. How does development of urban regulations and also principles encourage certain way the buildings, structures relate to the street, their functions, and also what kind of topologies emerged in these kind of specific types of streets, and what kind of functions and how do they behave. Another important comparison study was, this is another stage, I think I mixed up the file, was a study on relation between Istanbul and Stockholm, a parallel study of areas that, for example, Rinkaby was a planned city for Millau program, which is now inhabited with a lot of immigrants, many of them coming from Middle East and many of them coming from Turkey, but that part of the city does not have the vibrancy and does not have kind of capacity to reproduce itself the same way that Istanbul does, or parts of the Istanbul. So one of our students has chosen to compare the streets of Istiklal to Rinkaby and see how perhaps Rinkaby can be transformed by using the kind of patterns of cultural, how people actually use spaces. And this would, in fact, perhaps be used to influence the city to change the rules of public spaces used and introduce possibly new functions and the structures in that area of the city. So it was a thorough study. It included both spatial analysis, but also included kind of the systems of pattern of urban life, flows, urban flows, experiences, and so on. And then the second topic is the social ecological challenges. Now, there were two projects that were placed in this category. One was a study of Roma settlements and also projects that emerged from this study. Serbia and Macedonia in 2008. And this was a project that was conducted in collaboration with the Roma Tre University in Italy and Delft University, UN Habitat in Serbia, and Belgrade University Architecture School. During this time, in 2008, Berlusconi was forcefully moving Roma people from settlements around Rome, and University of Rome faculty decided to, and they started this initiative to do the project. So it was a very important project. At the same time that EU was asking Serbia to repatriate about 100,000 refugees, mainly of them Roma, who were forcefully abandoning Kosovo during the war in 1999. And then the second project is a Kai Tak Creek, Hong Kong. And that discusses social challenges and ecology in a different way, and I'm going to go into details later. First talking about project Roma. One of the students has chosen to actually look at immigration policy and social housing in Sweden. And this is a team which is, we're talking about 2008. Now this team is in the papers and it's in the press everywhere. Roma people, again, are discriminated against and they're still being kind of pushed out. So it's a very difficult social team, which is still current. I mean, we're talking about 2008, 5 years later, now it's current. I can say that we were quite ahead of time working on this project. So this project is also dealing with the housing policy in Malmö area, where you have a lot of immigrants, and also relation between housing, the types of housing provided, and legal asylum process, and looking for possibilities to improve conditions for housing for the people who are in that kind of asylum process, and also seeing how they can, even if it's a limited time, how we can improve their conditions, living conditions, and put the focus on them instead of bureaucratic processes. And then, again, expert from some of the projects is looking at this issue of Roma both from macro scale, from a large planning, but also zooming in later in the micro scale, looking at people's conditions and people's habits and working with them directly. This is one example of in Belgrade of existing urban infrastructure offering potential for new types of public spaces, and using it to actually, at a large scale, intervene to improve the Roma conditions. In Serbia, there's quite a lot of refugees from different wars, and many of them are Roma again. Here we were focusing exclusively on Roma people because their condition is most dire. It's most difficult in many cases. And and there was also a process of looking for ways of housing Roma. So it was also a very important project, and Belgrade University and also government were very interested in this. And so on. And then looking at micro scale, which I think seemed to be the most challenging, and also in a way most interesting part of the project, was actually analysis of different types of settlements and how does the architecture that's evolved in time simply by people building their own homes. Many of them are actually quite high quality homes made out of concrete and brick. How the patterns of use of spaces, how they influence the way that not only internal space but also public and urban space of these areas are shaped. instead of imposing and coming up with an idea of how we think somebody should actually live, and putting people in containers and working as a kind of big planners, instead going the other way and looking for ways of engagement of the local population and trying to understand what kind of needs do they actually have. And this is not just about some sort of opening and greening up areas, but actually looking at work and patterns, employment, education, very important questions that families are facing. Also cultural issues of how families in fact use spaces today, as was mentioned before. So here in this particular case, we have a student from Japan who in fact found quite a lot common in a very strange way between Roma culture and Japanese culture. So that was in terms of how one uses a space for the family, and the kitchen and the dining have different value, and also the public space has different quality than in the so-called Western context, and so on. And these are a few images from that project. Also, issues of so-called sustainability or ecological issues. I forgot to mention that the Rotterdam, our collaborators from Rotterdam, also were dealing with somewhat different topics. So we were kind of adopting, in a way, to that circumstance to use their knowledge or their research part, but also introducing our research on site. And it has to do with kind of potential for recycling, how Roma have developed the systems of recycling, and in fact are probably the pioneers of recycling of the entire Balkans. They're the ones who actually keep that active. It's not as much developed by the state and society itself, but in fact it's the Roma people who create the sustenance through recycling and reuse in quite advanced ways, and so on. So through combining the knowledge of Delft University and also knowledge of our research in Serbia and Macedonia, students were coming up with the kind of propositions of how this space could be transformed. And then the project in Hong Kong, it's a KTH Creek. This project we worked few years in a row, but looked at it in a different way, from different perspectives. One was, again, very micro. In this case, this is area, in this particular case that I'm going to talk about now, is looking at it from narrowing down on the street level without kind of a big picture, big planning proposition, but actually local scale, understanding the context of the site. This is a site of the former airport, and it's a large, which is very unusual for Hong Kong, the densest city in the world. In fact, there is a large open space now, open for development and construction. Interesting, important element of that former site is the KTH Creek, which is the kind of urban river which passes through here, emerges from the mountains, and in fact is artificial. It's turned into artificial structure by Japanese and during World War II, and later was used as a dumping canal or a canal for sewage of all the industrial waste. So it was extremely polluted. And during the recent years, it's been cleaned up, and this industry has moved out, and some certain type of ecology has emerged in or along of it. And all of a sudden, it started being seen by the communities around as an asset, as a potential asset, as an urban river. And urban rivers have been covered throughout. So these are a combination of social issues because of the community, local community and their needs, but also ecological issues. Also, interesting parallel was that this project, in fact, is a new Highline, the way I see it at least, because it's generated a lot of public discussion for years in a similar way. I lived in New York for many years, and I remember the discussions of Highline, of how Highline, and I've seen a lot of projects on it, and this is a Highline before any work was done. It was still a quite fascinating place, not really available for view by general public. You have to climb up illegally to get to see this amazing place. So it was an amazing place even before anything was done on it. And of course here you can see the transition between technological transformation of the city, how it occurred. It was a rail used for industrial railroad, and by that being removed from the city, turned into this kind of a wild natural space. Similarly, in Hong Kong, there is the kind of transformation of city which is very much visible in the city fabric. Sometimes it's manifested to complete erasure, like a Kowloon wall city that you see here. This kind of anomaly of urban space. And then here we have a Kai Tak Creek in its current form, that being basically taken over completely wildly, but it's sort of anticipating human intervention. And now it's being cooked up by many different architects and planners, activists, artists, and so on. Here is a fish that was caught. This was 10, 15 years ago. It was unthinkable that there would be any fish in Kai Tak Creek. Another important perspective in this project, working with students, was understanding of how kind of how people use space. It's when approaching the point where students are going to make a proposition, it's very important to read qualities of urban spaces and not necessarily expect that people are just going to adopt the space the way we are imagined. So this is quite complicated in a way, coming as foreigners or strangers to a context, but through collaboration with Chinese university and a lot of readings and studies on site, we try to map and understand the kind of qualities of present urban spaces. And a lot of times the surprises occur, the spaces that are in our context here unimaginable to see in this way, in this particular way, as a kind of picnic ground, they occur in Hong Kong. And then of course you have a student work that's been kind of emerging through this process, and a series of workshops together with Chinese students on site in Hong Kong and so on. This project is ongoing, as I mentioned, so we have more slides, but they don't fit in this format of today's presentation. I'm more talking generally. And then the third point is talking about urban culture. It could also be culture of urbanity. You could also twist the words with the focus of social-political economic issues. And here I'm going to take the quote from Laguerre in his relation to informal city, that informal city, the idea of informal city explores urban informality as site of power in relation to external discipline and central power, in contrast to the formalized spaces and practices. Urban informality is the expression of the freedom of the subject. There are a few projects we've done in this regard. It's a Hafen city in Hamburg, and then Slakthusområdet in Stockholm, the comparison and parallel projects, one first being done in one industrial area in the city of Hamburg, which is expanding with a new territory, and then also Slakthusområdet, exploring the potentials of Stockholm's meatpacking district. And then Kishinev, Moldova, as well as Stockholm and Belgrade, another project. And then coming back to Stockholm again through work with Färgfabriken. I'll talk briefly about the project, which is very important for my research as well, licentiate, and that is to understand the processes of urban changes in post-Soviet context. I think one can learn quite a lot because of the process of transition from a Soviet system and a really very, I would say, centralized and structured modernist planning tradition to something which is, I would say, totally opposite, but with some remnants or fragments of a residue of some kind of ideological attitudes towards planning, which are used and misused by different agents when certain interests are to be implemented. It's a very difficult context to understand, but also incredibly exciting and interesting in terms of what kind of urbanities have emerged through this kind of site of devastation, or a place of devastation, where you can see more of elements of destruction and removal than the actually generative processes. But still there are generative processes that we were sort of studying and trying to understand how they function. And this is a poster from our participation in workshops and study trips that was sponsored by Swedish Institute. And it started with the project together with Fabriken within the project titled New Urban Topologies. So here are certain pictures of the site, different places in the city that have been adopted by different users due to the abandonment. The artists and also go-karts at the same time. You have a gated community next to it. Different types of typologies and the ways that people themselves are transforming the city, not necessarily positive or negative analysis of this, but more kind of understanding what is going on and why. And in a way attempting to evaluate the architectonic quality or urban quality, what kind of space is emerged from this. And interesting conclusions which one could draw from these kind of studies and analysis that a lot of Western architects are using a self-organization, ideas, kind of new thinking in planning as a way towards future and urban sustainability. So the kind of analysis of processes that are actually happening due to certain forms of self-regulations could, in fact, we could draw lessons from that and understand that it's not that simple and understand better the patterns that actually occur in society. Then also relation of what legal is and illegal is. Quite a lot of illegal construction happening in Chisinau, how the rules are manipulated, what is the role of government, and also how, again, going back, how does that affect the transformation of the urban space. And then the focus of this project in terms of design, coming from students and my perspective, was also through discussion with our local partners, the image is not very good, that what's really needed and what's has disappeared in a way is a notion of a civic center, but maybe this kind of notion is not the same traditional one, maybe needs to be rediscovered. What is today's civic center for the post-Soviet context and also for this country, which is between European Union and Russia. And it's a kind of on the margins of development of European expansion or development of being included in European Union. So there's a variety of approaches. Some projects are combining architecture with infrastructure, looking for possibilities, but also looking at patterns of use of space and also the needed spaces in the city. Some projects are looking at the idea of a civic space through a certain type of commercial activities and intensifying them, reading them as architecture, and some projects are discussing the power relations and engagement of local population in decision-making processes in relation to particular sites and particular buildings that are a residue of those processes that are already occurred. So every project is very site-specific, but also has a kind of a theme that relates to the whole city or society and the processes that are ongoing and so on. Then it's also adoption or transformation of existing abandoned buildings and trying to find a way to look at those in a different way. Another project, maybe in some way similar, is the one we did. We worked in Belgrade. It's in Savamala district, which is not a real big industrial area, but it's part of the heart of the waterfront of the center core of the city and a working class area from pre-war, talking about pre-World War II period, that has, after World War II, due to new constructions and new infrastructure, railroads and highways being cut off, and then during the 90s and the war has been quite devastated and abandoned. So today this space is used by a lot of cultural activities, but it's also a kind of a deadlock of any kind of further adoption or incorporation of that area into the rest of the city. It's not being used to its own full potential. So we were looking also at different theories, urban theories, but at the same time understanding realities of the site. And then some projects, for example, are looking at the present owners, also social and cultural actors who have adopted and have using territories, and how the territorialization of this area is already occurring. And then kind of looking as well as a neoliberal context of the city, the investment, the interests, and how certain synergies can be found between different actors. This is done in a sort of non-judgmental way, not to say that we are all enjoying and really believing in the moral aspect of neoliberalism, but it's actually quite affected and transformed the urban fabric, both and also society in a negative way, both in Chisinau and post-Soviet system and also post-war environment of Balkans. But we were looking here at how the local forces or local citizens could also engage in a more effective way in transforming their city and adopting it and taking parts of it. So the kind of different types of mapping, understanding of emerging or emerged typologies, how they work, how they function, what kind of overlaps, what kind of hybridities, and what kind of combinations can occur in certain scenarios that students are asked to develop themselves and test, and how those scenarios would, in fact, perhaps in a more beneficial way, transform urban environment. So this is also an issue how the project is presented as a strategy, as a process, as a force field of energies, but also architectural possibilities. So it's a constant exploration of all these different aspects which we don't have control of, but we learn some aspects of them, and so on. So the site itself and the programs that are tested and discussed are possibly proposed as a generative social actors that can in themselves transform the surrounding urban environment through human engagement in different levels, both from the city, but also from local cultural organizations and the inhabitants themselves. This is another, I'll just talk about it briefly, a little bit different approach by another student from Denmark, actually, which was a way to completely read the site through different type of geometry, interpreted from inside out, without necessarily accepting the exterior walls of the city, but reading it as an event space in relationship to the festival which is occurring there every May. Actually, it's coming up very soon. It's called Mixer Festival, which is a combination of art, architecture, interventions, and as well as certain commercial and other I would say, type of events, such as concerts. So there's a kind of overlap between culture and commercialism here, which is not always applauded by everybody, but people are looking for, because of the absence of the state and the funding coming from the state, people in culture are looking for other sources for financing survival, their own survival, but also how the culture in the city can continue to exist. Also, very important is the presence of Goethe Institute, who is, in fact, adopted one of the buildings, and construction is going to start very soon of using it as a kind of outpost of the Goethe Institute in Belgrade. And then the last of the topics that I'm going to discuss is I was a little bit, I would say, I took an excerpt from Slavoj Žižek's lecture where he stated nature does not exist, and the kind of questioning of the notion of relation between ecology and sustainability and the city and human activity, the kind of questioning the whole premise that there is a separation between of us living in one world and then nature being something else external to us, but also the kind of looking at what is our human activity, what is the role of it, what is the power of it, evaluating it as a process which is both impotent but also omnipotent, which is power struggle within ourselves, understanding that we can at the same time totally destroy Earth, but at the same time that we can be destroyed, or the civilization can be destroyed. So human activity becomes a geological factor. And I'll read a short. Humanity is not just one among other living species, but is clearly becoming a geological factor. Maybe paradoxically, we should accept that nature does not exist, in the sense that the image of nature that we spontaneously accept, nature as a balanced, harmonized circulation that is destroyed by excessive human agency, that nature does not exist. Nature is itself a series of mega catastrophes. And we are already in the technology. We should remain open, work much more with social discipline. Maybe one of the consequences of ecological crisis, American way of life, vision of free spending, liberty of consumption, will have to get out of the picture. We need to invent a new way of living together. So it's also a political message which not only has to do with the kind of looking at differently in relation between us and our technology and nature, but also reinventing the social. And the question here is also, how can this be done through planning, or how can it be done through architecture? Perhaps it's an impossible task, but it's quite exciting possibility of testing different scenarios. And here we can talk about 3 projects. Chongming Island in Shanghai, and then there's some thesis projects that was done in Shanghai as well, and then the third one is a Kaita Creek, which is the same project we worked before, but in a different way, in a different perspective. Here there was a famous city considered to be a sustainable city, Dongtan, that was to be built on the island of Chongming, which is the 3rd largest island in China. And it's a neighbor, or actually it's a part of Shanghai. It belongs to Shanghai. And it's, you can see a picture on the right. This is the very common image of Chongming Island. It's supposed to be this kind of place devoid of any urban space, or really a city environment. And on the other side you have the kind of a city of pleasure, of desire, intensity, density as well, Shanghai. And this is Pudong district. Pudong, I think 20 years ago, was very similar as the picture on the right. So it's also very interesting that the kind of development that occurs in China is explosive. And what we learned while going there is that Dongtan ecological city never occurred. It was more of a, I would say, I guess it's a failed project, but it was. It seems to be that it was used as a kind of strategic marketing campaign more than the actual ecological project. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, so we went there and we worked together with Tongji University on the Chongming Island and work on a kind of alternative ways to look at the ecology and how this island can be transformed in alternative ways, not necessarily turning into another Pudong. The reasons for this is very important, is that this island is, has an aquifer, which is a source of fresh, I would say, drinking water under its surface, and very important for survival of the city. At the same time, it's a place where you could get and produce fresh food still in a really close proximity of the city. At the same time, while we were there for 2 years, we saw drastic transformation, new bridges, highways built, and also we discovered there's a whole city actually existing on this island, which looked like Baltimore or another kind of US say business center connected with a system of highways. And then the resulting project, students working workshops, visiting the site at Tongji University, intense collaboration, working at different types of analysis, both of the patterns of development in Shanghai, understanding of, again, how people use space, how the streets are formed, what is a built form, and how is it filled in with life of the city, and so on. But in this context, testing the relation between higher density and lower density of habitation that would be appropriate for urbanizing this island. So it wasn't we were not trying to say that this island is not going to be urbanized, but the question is that how is it going to be urbanized? By what means? There were different strategies emerging out of that from students. So kind of a coexistence of ecology, but also the urbanization, which is inevitable. It's very hard to stop in China. And then another project, which is also in Shanghai, that was running parallel in our one of our students, was a kind of idea of adoption of urban infrastructure, highways, and how the highways were really dominating and dissecting the urban scape. On one level, you have highway systems; on the other, you have parks, and parks are not used a lot actually for human activity, except for a few hours a day, and then the bridge spaces as well are quite dominating because of this kind of verticality that occurs quite often with bridges and so on. So there were certain discontinuities and disconnections within the city pattern that were explored here, and how they could be, how new continuities could be enhanced, a new type of uses, how the structure both of the park and the highway could be somehow merged in a kind of new type of space. And then this year we had a workshop with David Garcia, and students were making some kind of a vision of Hong Kong that was discussing, I would say, this sort of notion of Anthropocene. These images look real, but they're not real. They're partially real, and it's, I would say, if you don't know, if you haven't been in Hong Kong, you don't know that this rock doesn't exist, actually. But there is a quite interesting contrast between the city and also its surroundings, with the mountains around it. Okay, perfect. And this other image is actually transforming the rock into a building or a structure. So this rock, which doesn't actually exist, the students have turned it into a new type of building which integrates some kind of architectural expression as well, inhabitation, with a new vision of transforming the urban space in a kind of surreal way. You can see people sightseeing on top and hanging out on top of this building landscape. This was the Kai Tak Creek project, but looking at Hong Kong infrastructural systems, also patterns of development in comparison to other paradigms from around the world. So we started by looking at these other types of paradigms. For example, the project, actually Barcelona, CERT's Barcelona plan as one of the examples of typological development, which is drastically different, but it's another type of density. Through kind of comparison study of understanding between relation of urban form, urban typologies, and also qualities and levels of density, Hong Kong and Barcelona, for example. And here we looked at the innovative systems of movement, and also different ways, on the third, on the lowest tier, different ways that urban infrastructure has been displaced by new type of urban park, which in this case was a project in South Korea, in Seoul. Also, in this case, we were looking, our students were developing on tools of interpreting data and also comparing data in a graphic way, through graphics. In this particular drawing, you can see a student comparing to different urban environments, but also to different people, how their habits of consumption and also travel, qualities of life, urban accessibility, and so on, can be described through a year and through a day. And then we measured as well how does the pattern of life of that particular person compare between two different cities, and also how their habits or their urban environment change or affect the kind of question of some questions of sustainability. In the end, it was brought down to making a calculation of CO2, levels of CO2. So then it was also put in a perspective towards the end of this analysis, which was done by every single student in the studio, how important certain elements of our habits, some habits, but also certain elements of our life in urban environment which we can't control ourselves. So what can we control, what we can't control? And different type of perspective was put on what can we do as well as architects and planners, and where we can make an impact. And this kind of complexity, understanding of complexities, then was compared between Stockholm and Barcelona. It also depends on where the students come from. So we were, in a way, taking advantage. We have a multinational student body. So some students were making comparison between patterns of Barcelona or London or Stockholm. But also how one could improve the urban sustainability in terms of taking advantage of the wind patterns instead of using AC. What about the water as a part of a cooling system, vegetation, and local tradition, building tradition, and also the sun. This is an example of a project from last year. It's also in Kai Tak, which is again a kind of ongoing discussion with the Chinese university, also involving the planning office in Hong Kong. And this is one of the projects that talked about the new monorail and what could happen along this monorail. Students change somewhat this monorail system, which is planned anyway. It's going to happen anyway. Here we also have some buildings that are already built. Here on the bottom we have Norman Foster, new shipping terminal. So students are incorporating the existing urban fabric with potential new patterns and looking at this as a sort of unified system, that this kind of infrastructure which is introduced, how it can connect disconnected areas of the city, which are, it's also reusing of existing infrastructure of highways that are there and built, and students are proposing that they are defunct since the absence of the airport does not require such a big load of highway connection as a perimeter around this site, but instead there's different types of transportation, but also different types of use of this space. And then kind of zooming in on different areas and looking at how they can be used and proposing architectural and urban typologies. And another project which in a way is interesting because maybe in a kind of unconscious way it's even related to architectural tradition. And we have a project by Le Corbusier, or a kind of a wall house, as a sort of super infrastructure, superstructure, which integrates both. So it's a reflection of the history of architecture as well, which sometimes is brought back to be questioned, but also can it be reintroduced in another way, and how can we bring back the power of architecture? In Hong Kong, in a way, the whole city itself is more powerful than the individual acts of architectures. The city itself is kind of agglomeration, as I mentioned in the beginning, Lefebvre's productivist city. I would say that Hong Kong, in a way, is the kind of a productivist city in its own. But it has a capacity to adopt any kind of large-scale intervention into something else. So let's say that there was a large plan to introduce the mega structure, which is a system of both movement of cars and people, how that place then evolve and how it would transform itself through the kind of micro interventions by citizens or the inhabitants, and that is happening quite a lot in Hong Kong. So kind of transition between the large scale and the small scale, and so on. Here is another thesis project which is going back again. The student went through all this during the 4th year, in the part of a 5th year, has experienced both Chisinau, perspective on Stockholm as well as Hong Kong, and is coming up with proposal for the area in Sponga, where he discovered maybe not similar, but maybe in some way similar conditions of a creek which has been covered and abandoned, and he looks for a way for this creek to re-emerge and be part of qualities of urban city. But at the same time, he's looking at the Stockholm plan, regional plan for 2030 and focusing on a certain area and trying to really see in what way can the kind of proposition of vocability be established, but also many of the issues and questions within that plan that are very vaguely discussed, how can they actually be implemented through new types of urban regulations and perhaps encouragement or discouragement of urban patterns, flows, forms of housing, adoption and appropriation of some public spaces, while at the same time enhancing qualities of another types of public spaces, such as this creek and other open areas, and using different tools of analyzing the movements of people, such as spatial analysis that you see here on the right, but also developing different types of possibilities and kind of topologies which are not present now. And then these could, in fact, benefit in many ways the surrounding areas and contribute to their prosperity and connectivity between each other and so on. So what I want to say is that the idea of a thesis projects is they kind of culminate in a maybe not necessarily a new way, but students passing the 4th year and then starting with the 5th year and going into a thesis, they have a certain knowledge which enables them to test other possibilities than those that are necessarily a part of the practice today, both as an architect but also as a planner, as well as really gaining the tools to engage in the actual urban problems, formulating them, looking at them from a different perspective, etc. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and this is all for today.